Bob Woodward, director of From Iowa to the White House, a study of the media role in the 1988 presidential campaign. How did the Iowa caucuses become so important to the presidential candidate nominating process? Well,
I think the history is an important one for understanding things even that are going on today. Primarily, after Jimmy Carter came to Iowa in '76 and did what he did and sort of came out of obscurity from Georgia to end up as President of the United States, people decided, both candidates and the media decided that Iowa was important, and it was the first test for candidates who would be president. And after that, with every subsequent campaign until this one, it seems that Iowa took on a growing importance. This one, however, is a bit different.
We'll talk about that. We've got about half an hour with you and our audience that can engage in that discussion. But first, when was the first Iowa caucus?
The Iowa caucus, in terms of its importance in modern political history, from 1972 on is what's really important. In '72, if you went back and look at some of the coverage by some reporters, the national news organizations, you would see that there was a growing attention to Iowa because of the reforms within the Democratic Party and what the caucus process meant. And it was between '72 and '76 that some people, including the Jimmy Carters of the world and some advisors, figured out that Iowa was going to become more important, and it just sort of became almost a steamrolling process after that. I've always felt that the idea that it was first or is first is something that just can't be overlooked, no matter whether people might have questions about the process itself. The first, in the journalistic mind, anyone who's worked in journalism or anybody who observes it, if you say something is first, well, reporters will come and take a look at it.
We are continuing with our special expanded edition of Road to the White House this Friday night, and we've got for the next half hour or so our guest Bob Woodward from Drake University. He's a former journalist and, as we said, director of the study of the media. We're going to focus tonight on what role the Iowa caucuses currently play in national politics, what they played in the past and how they got that way. We invite your participation. Please use the phone numbers that appear at the bottom of the screen, and we'll go to the phones as quickly as we can. But first, I should identify you, sir, as Professor Woodward, and note that you have your journalistic credentials through having worked at the Washington Star newspaper, at the national desk, and at the world desk. And you were also, for that newspaper, I guess, the Democratic Convention bureau chief at the '72 convention.
That's right, I was.
And yes, sir. Go ahead.
And after spending time at the Star from '65 to '72, came back to Iowa, which is my home state. My family and I came back here and been here from since that time.
Where you are now professor of journalism. Okay.
That's right.
Well, you alluded to one point that we should settle right now, and that is, how important do you think the Iowa caucus is in 1992?
I think it's only as important as candidates interpret it to be, and as the media end up telling us it is. And if we look at the coverage and if we look at the nature of what's transpired up to this point, its importance is only in that it is first. It seems to me that now that the native son Tom Harkin is in the Democratic race, it changed all the conditions here. It would be important after the process Monday night if certain things happened. If Harkin, for example, didn't do as well as the media thought he should do, it would be important if some sort of surprise occurred. It seems that's somewhat unlikely. Aside from that, it's changed dramatically from where it was in 1988 and previously.
One more preliminary point, and that is, we mentioned that you were the director of a study. This is a transcript of a portion of that, From Iowa to the White House. What is this all about? And we're showing the audience the booklet.
Well, in '87 and in 1988, my colleagues, three of them and I, traveled Iowa, traveled across the country. Two of us went to both conventions. Two of us went to New Hampshire. And all of this was part of a process of watching the process, watching the candidates, watching the media. And ultimately, we held a national conference at Drake University in November of 1988, a conference that incidentally was carried for 3 days on C-SPAN. And it was a part of a process of seeking to focus attention in a comprehensive way on the whole media role. And out of that, we're continuing to watch the process, and I think ultimately we may have some comparative material between 1988 and 1992.
And Professor, we'll get to some of your conclusions. We'll also show some of the pictures that are contained in the report as we go to the phones. Litchfield, Connecticut is first. Go ahead, please.
Good evening, Mr. Woodward. I've always enjoyed your books. I'm going to throw out a quick statistic that I've not seen reported anywhere that I'm really kind of curious to hear your reaction to. I went through the only source I had at hand, which was Consumer Reports, which reprints the product recalls for automobiles, and added up all of the ones for last year. And the total U.S. brand cars were 3,500,000.
Tell you what, caller, I'm going to interrupt to ask you. We've got Professor Woodward, who is not the Bob Woodward of the Washington Post, to talk about the Iowa caucuses. Do you have a point that's related in any way to that subject?
Not specifically to Iowa, no.
Okay. Do you mind if we go on then?
No, that's all right.
Thank you very much. I suppose we should establish that although you are Bob Woodward, you've had that confusion in the past.
I could only take a moment to tell you that I worked part-time at the Washington Post as a sports copy editor before I went to the Star, and so I like to say that I'm the Bob Woodward who worked at the Post before Bob Woodward.
San Diego, California is next. Go ahead, please.
Yes. I wonder, in Iowa, it appears, well, Dave, first, I mean, I had several questions. First of all, will David Duke be on the ballot, in your opinion, and would he be covered at all by the press? It appears that there's a conspiracy to deny him total coverage. The second question is, if Buchanan is on, don't you feel in a way he's kind of a stalking horse for Bush, and in fact he's really part of the Bush strategy in throwing out ideas such as a quasi-racism and a kind of an edgy kind of anti-welfare.
Okay, sir. Thank you, San Diego.
I'd be happy to talk about candidates such as Pat Buchanan in terms of media coverage. I think Pat Buchanan especially is an interesting one for media people because he essentially has been a media personality himself, and now he's running for the Republican nomination. He comes out of a television background. He's probably most well known because of what he has done in television. So it poses a certain type of coverage problem. He's almost one of the journalistic fraternity, or certainly the media fraternity, and the way he's covered really shouldn't be any different than the way any other candidate is covered, but it's a question, it seems to me, of how do you cover someone who comes out of the world of television and essentially says, now I want to run for president. We may have more of these. To a certain extent, Pat Robertson was that sort of candidate in the past.
Professor, back to the Iowa caucus issue. How did it come to the media's attention that Jimmy Carter was making some strides in '76? It's kind of a chicken and an egg question. Did he ask the media to come in, or did they sniff it out on their own?
There are different interpretations of who identified first the sort of emergence of Jimmy Carter in Iowa, but I recall particularly one story by Johnny Apple of the New York Times, a page one story during that campaign that identified the forces at work here in the state that seemed to be coalescing around Jimmy Carter, and that story and several others by national news organizations made Iowa, made Jimmy Carter, and after that it was, well, Iowa forever, except this year.
Has the party tried to institutionalize that prominence in any way? I guess it would be both parties.
Certainly the parties have benefited in terms of turnouts and in terms of party participation by the national media attention. It seems to me that over the years that's been a positive aspect for just participation both among Democrats and Republicans.
All right, back to the phones. North Platte, Nebraska. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Professor. I have a question to ask you, and it's kind of an intellectual question because I don't quite understand it, and I've heard different theories. For example, if a Democratic contender comes in first or second in your state, and maybe first and second in New Hampshire, could there still be someone that they call a dark horse get the convention vote, and how does that dark horse work?
All right, ma'am, thank you.
I think the questioner has identified something that's worth talking about. Let me make a couple of points on that. First, in 1988 and in past years, especially in 1988, there was a link between what happened in Iowa and what happened in New Hampshire, a very close link. Some candidates fell by the wayside because of how they finished in Iowa. Some profited greatly by what they did in Iowa and then did in New Hampshire. There was sort of this almost inextricable link between the two states. This time around, in terms of what we would call the winnowing process, because of Tom Harkin being in the race, it's different, and I think we don't know because we haven't had a situation quite like this. In terms on the Democratic side, if Harkin leaves Iowa unscathed in the terms of political reporters, does what he's expected to do, and goes on to New Hampshire, I suspect that won't profit him greatly in terms of media interpretation. So really, New Hampshire becomes either the test, or we might ask the question of whether New Hampshire in the media mind would be coupled with one or more subsequent tests down the road. It's much less clear than what we've had in the recent years, I think.
Briefly, Professor, did this study reach any conclusions about the quality of media coverage in these caucuses?
I think that the general conclusion was that the coverage was comprehensive, was for the most part very good. There are certainly flawed areas, the troublesome questions of how you cover a candidate's character, the whole question of paid media, political advertising. In 87, 88, we had something dramatic that we haven't yet seen. This time we had a number of debates among the candidates. There were, in Iowa and New Hampshire, there was all sort of focus on the issues, and we haven't had that many debates this time around.
Let's go back to the phones. This Fall River, Massachusetts, and once again the photographs we're showing you are from the report's contents, and they're all pictures of the 88 campaign. Fall River, Mass. Go ahead, please.
Hello, how you doing?
Hi.
My name's Bobby Jones, and I'm calling from Florida, Massachusetts. I'd just like to say hi to C-SPAN and hi to Mr. Woodward. I'm just wondering, Mr. Woodward, are you a Tom Harkin supporter?
Well, I'll tell you, caller, that our point with Professor Woodward this evening is to have him on in his capacity as a professor of journalism at Drake University, and of course you can answer any question you want, but I don't expect that you're here to offer your own political views.
Well, I can answer the question insofar as a long history in Iowa. I'm registered as an independent, so you wouldn't find that with my journalistic background, you wouldn't find me stating positions on the candidates. I'm interested in the media and how they cover the candidates.
Well, then let me give the caller another chance. Caller?
Yes. I know you're an independent, but I mean, Mr. Woodward, would you side more? You must side more Democrat than Republican.
Well, I'll tell you what, I think Mr. Woodward has answered the question, and in the interest of focusing on the process and the media role, let's go to Portland, Oregon. Go ahead, please.
Hi, this is Portland, Oregon, and I had a comment comparing Pat Buchanan to Pat Robertson. Geez, that's not even, I don't even think that's funny or anything. It certainly isn't right. Pat Buchanan's been a lot closer to the White House than most of these Democrats will. And,
I wasn't, no, I wasn't. I think my point, if you misinterpreted it, or maybe I didn't state it as clearly as I should have, I was saying that they had come out of backgrounds in which they were on television a lot, and that they may profit somewhat because of all the appearances they've made on television. They're different kind of candidates in that regard than someone, let's say, who came through a senatorial track or a gubernatorial track. That's what I was trying to establish. And we may have, down the road in the future, we may have more what we might call TV personalities who want to run for president. And it's something that we need to address in terms of how we cover these people. Should they be covered differently? How do we look at who they are and what they stand for?
Professor, briefly before this next call, you've got a section in the book or the report called Covering the Caucuses, What Worked and What Didn't. What do you think worked in covering the caucuses themselves?
I think what worked in covering the caucuses, as it shows up in the section, was that you had 13 people out here, Democrats and Republicans in '87, '88, who wanted to be president, and they were tested in time and time again in debates, and they were covered in all sorts of situations, and whether or not people are not fully satisfied with the caucus process itself, it was still probably as near as you'll get to the idea of what a democratic society ought to do in choosing its presidents. Plenty of chances to see the candidates in action and extensive coverage.
Lansing, Michigan is next. Go ahead. Lansing, you're on the air. Lansing, Michigan, are you there? Okay, I guess they're not. We'll go on to somebody else in a moment. When the media spent money, where did it go, and how do you think it was wasted or used most effectively?
I mean, in terms of spending it on coverage?
Yes.
Well, I'm not a budget person in a news organization. My feeling has always been is the news organizations are never willing to spend enough money to cover campaigns. That may show a bias because of my journalistic background. I'm particularly concerned in this campaign with the major networks cutting back, or certainly in many cases diminishing the amount of coverage that they're providing. I think, I'm not talking here right now about CNN or C-SPAN, I'm talking about the other three networks. I think that in a democratic society where you want to see who's running for president, see what they're saying, I think there should be, that ought to be a big budget item.
Well, let's talk about, after this next call, the differences that you see between this year and 1988. But we did find Lansing. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Yeah, I have a question. I really share the professor's frustration, being that New Hampshire and Iowa come so before, like the Michigan primaries, and with candidates like Tom Harkin being in support in Detroit area. Do you ever think that we're going to have a one day where all the primaries throughout the country happen at once? Because as the process is now, it's so distorted by the media, as those candidates who are ahead in New Hampshire are the lead candidates for the rest of the country.
I understand the thrust of your question, and I think in a certain sense, you've identified one of the problems with presidential campaigns. They're too long and probably too strung out, and certain states get much more emphasis than others. The question is, if you're going to collapse the process, do you have regional primaries? Do you have, you seem to be suggesting almost a national primary. The problem is that no matter what you try to do, there will always be some state or series of state, a group of states would be first, and you're going to you would have this major media emphasis on whatever would be first.
Other than the difference in number of journalists, what do you see different between this year and 1988?
Well, the number of journalists is different, and just the volume of coverage, if you think about in 87, 88 with 13 candidates and much more participation early on by all the major news organizations, you just had a greater volume of coverage. You had much more, seems to me, variety in the coverage. You had maybe you had too much. Some people would say it was overkill. I think not. We had a longer process in which to make some determinations about the people who would be president. One of the things that's happening this time around, for example, if you think about the scrutiny that's been applied recently to Bill Clinton, or it might be to other people, a lot of the things that we went through in 1987, let's say on Joe Biden and Gary Hart, we were past those very early in the campaign. The campaign was longer. Now we have a situation where the campaign started later. The reporters really are working in a different phase in the way they were looking at campaigns, and consequently, we're getting a lot of things, it seems to me, and we'll likely get more in a very accelerated pace. By collapsing the amount of time, you get an accelerated pace on a lot of these items.
All right, another scene from 1988 as we go to Los Angeles, California. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Hello, gentlemen.
Hello.
My question was to the gentleman from Iowa. Why is it that, I guess from the journalistic point of view, I'm not too sure, that New Hampshire gets so much more attention to the caucus coming up when Iowa is first and New Hampshire is second?
Well, sir, it's primarily this time around, it's come down to Senator Tom Harkin running here in Iowa, a native son, and his presence would skew the whole process among Democratic supporters. Very few of the other Democratic candidates have spent much time here. On the other side, we have an incumbent president. So neither party the races are just dramatically different, and the national media have made choices which I think probably are the right choices to essentially not cover Iowa extensively. A number of them are here now for the last few days, but what that has done is heighten considerably the media attention in New Hampshire, and I think we don't have anything in recent political history quite like this. The media are really under a test, as are candidates in New Hampshire, to see what happens, who the winners will be, who the losers will be. It's very conceivable that what might have been a two-step process, Iowa and New Hampshire, is going to end up being a one-step process, New Hampshire and out, or New Hampshire and in.
Queens, New York. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Yes, good evening, Professor. My question involves the abortion issue and the media's failure to really closely cover Bush's switch from the late 1970s, when he was a pro-choice politician. He believed in a woman's right to choose. And then in the 1980s, to curry favor with the right wing of his party, he virtually sold out the right of women. And I feel this is a key issue, a key character issue. And that's really not stressed in the media. There is no doubt there were speeches that were given up in New Hampshire when he ran against Ronald Reagan, where he was pro-choice, and he has changed on this important issue, which is really an issue that's very, very important to women.
All right, sir. Thank you.
I think the media would argue that George Bush's evolving position on this question or on any question, indeed any candidate's change of position, would have been reported, would have been logged considerably in the national media, and it's just a question of how many times certain stories or certain elements are reported. The broader question is, to what extent do media track what we call dramatic changes in candidate positions, and then to what extent do they return and tell the readers or the viewers again and again, this is what it is. It seems to me that that's really what you're talking about. If we could, in the Bush case, for example, we might look at his positions on a whole range of issues and say, where was he in this year and where is he today? But we could do the same for any candidate, and I suspect that we would see some shifts among candidates in both of the major parties.
This 1988 scene is from Ames, Iowa. That's Jules Witkover on the left, a nationally syndicated columnist. He's talking to John Margolis of the Chicago Tribune. And as we go to Naples, Florida, we should mention in the previous picture, if you remember, there was a young man on the left. That was David Yepsen, who is a political reporter for the Des Moines Register. Naples, Florida is next. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Professor Woodward about Tom Harkin's prior primary history in his campaigns in Iowa, his senatorial, and then before that the congressional campaigns. Has he ever had any serious primary challenges? I know he's beaten incumbent Republicans, but I'm interested in how he's done in primary, or the extent to which he's been challenged.
And caller, if you don't mind, let me add a twist to it, and that is, because of your expertise, what kind of media treatment would you say the senator has gotten, both as a challenger and as an incumbent?
Well, we're in a state with very good news organizations in Des Moines and outstate, both in print and broadcast, and we're in a state with what has been called for a number of years one of the nation's top 10 newspapers, the Des Moines Register. So my feeling is, and will continue to be, that that you will get good substantive coverage. We have had good substantive coverage of Tom Harkin, of Chuck Grassley, of our Governor Terry Branstad. Second guessers could always say you missed some, you haven't done maybe all you should have, but overall, this is a good media state, and it's a great state for politics. And if politicians are doing things, you'll hear about it in the Des Moines Register or other places.
And as to his point about the actual success of Senator Harkin, how has it been? Does he rack up the high totals, or?
I must say that I don't have those things in my mind the way I should. This state is interesting because Tom Harkin, a Democrat, and Chuck Grassley, a Republican, both represent us in the Senate, and that perhaps tells you something about Iowa voters.
All right, Professor, time for one more call. This one from Los Angeles, California. You're on the air.
Hi, Professor. I noticed that after the 60 Minutes lead, 60 Minutes with the Super Bowl lead, and everybody started recognizing Clinton, he was more recognizable and more well-liked. But I was wondering, do you think now he should position himself more aggressively vis-a-vis liberalism, affirmative action, quotas, some of the more controversial issues?
I think that Bill Clinton and the other Democrats have a question in relation to the media coverage and the name recognition factor. Bill Clinton has moved rather quickly from somewhat obscure governor, at least in some cases, in Arkansas, onto the national scene, onto the covers of news magazines, and onto 60 Minutes and other places. In this sort of environment, it's a very intensive sort of environment, media environment, what he does in terms of shifting positions or what he does in terms of anything is going to be under this intense scrutiny. So I don't pretend to understand what he might do, but I know almost anything he does now, there'll be 100 reporters here, there, or somewhere else looking over his shoulder.
Professor Woodward, final point and related perhaps, do you sense in any of your observations anything like a media backlash that benefits any of the candidates this run?
Well, we keep hearing talk in different campaigns about media backlash, and I've wondered about it this time around, particularly on the character issue, but I've always felt that the media role is one thing and the candidate's role is another, and they're not consistently together. They're on different tracks.
All right, sir. Thank you, Professor Bob Woodward from Drake University. We appreciate your time this evening.
Thank you very much.
And to our audience, thank you for joining us. Thanks for your calls. Have a good evening.